Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to contribute my thoughts on the 2024-25 state budget. And as one of the newest members of Parliament, I admit to feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the hundreds, maybe thousands of pages of paper that have found their way to my desk in the last week since the budget was delivered in the other place on Thursday last week, including budget papers and subsequent documents to assist us in preparation for the 40-odd hours of budget estimates hearings we will participate in next week. It's a lot. It is a lot for new independent members, or for a new independent member, myself, to take in and try and analyse in a short time, especially with the analysis and pressure of other legislative reform the government was trying to achieve in the form of the State Coastal Policy Validation Bill in the very same week bearing down. However, I am here to represent the people of Elwick, so Mr. President, represent them I will do to the best of my ability, and in my contribution I'll focus mostly on what the budget appears to deliver for them. I understand that questions on detailed line items should be reserved for the budget estimates hearings, and what we are being asked to do with the motion before us today is to note the budget. So where I do allude to questions in my contribution, it's in the context of my thoughts and hopes for what this budget may deliver and my aspirations for the expenditure of taxpayer funds more broadly. I do hope that this is appropriate, Mr. President. I'll share some of my reflections and we'll try to be optimistic in the face of the disastrous financial position Tasmania appears to be in, which I don't need to outline, as been clearly articulated by the Honourable Member for Murchison. Thank you, Member for Murchison, and thank you to the Member for Nelson, who has added a comprehensive analysis to that as well. And thank you to all members of this House, who I've certainly learnt a lot from as I've listened to your contributions on this state budget 2024-25. So whilst I'll try to be optimistic, it won't all be positive. I'll try to present my thoughts, though, as a compliment sandwich, identifying positives, challenges and opportunities in relation to some of the budget highlights. And whilst I may welcome many of the initiatives presented in this budget, I am also conscious that they rely on significant debt to deliver, which means whilst we now may reap the benefits of the budget deliverables, it will be future generations who will have to pay. And it's something that weighs heavily on me, I'm very conscious of. So I'll start with transport services. I know extending the commitment to half-price bus fares until June 2025 is certainly welcomed by my community, many who are struggling with cost of living pressures. But there are still concerns in my community about the reliability of metro bus services, and I do question whether people would rather pay full fare and have buses turn up on time. But for now, more money in the pocket of those who are struggling is welcomed, and I live in hope that the government continues to work on improving the reliability of bus services, as was also promised during the election. I also live in hope that the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor, a key part of the Hobart City deal signed 5 years ago in 2019, will be delivered within the next 5 years, as all three levels of government committed to in signing the Hobart City deal. I note that page 142 of budget paper number 1 includes $106.5 million over 4 years for the Urban Congestion Fund. The footnote explains that this project includes the state and Australian government contributions of $52 million for Hobart public transport infrastructure planning, $22 million for the intelligent transport solution, and the $20 million commitment to Derwent ferry infrastructure. No specific mention of the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor, Mr. President. So I keenly await more answers to questions about the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor that I will ask next week in estimates to hear more about where this overstudied and long talked about and long awaited project is at. Continuing on transport, I am all for the ferry terminal at Wilkinson's Point. How great to better use our river highway that doesn't incur complaints about potholes, nor the cost of fixing them. On roads, I note $75 million for Brooker Highway upgrades appears on page 144 of budget paper number 1 under the heading Projects Contingent on Australian Government Funding. As Mayor of Glenorchy, I wrote to the government on behalf of council and our community a number of times calling for the urgent installation of infrastructure at the Brooker Highway Duncan Street intersection, where every day hundreds of cars precariously cross in and out to access both Montrose Bay High School and the Montrose Bay Foreshore Park and Walkway. Whilst this project is not specifically mentioned, I am hopeful that the $75 million for Brooker Highway upgrades mentioned in the budget papers does include this project, because it is really important to my community and critical for the safety of all Brooker Highway users. It's been talked about for over 10 years, and I'll certainly keep advocating for it until it's delivered. Community safety more broadly is another priority in my community, Mr President, and across Tasmania too. So it's pleasing to see an additional 60 police are to be recruited, with $140 million in new funding for Tasmania Police. There's mention of a permanent strike force team of 20 police focused on serial offenders. This is welcomed as a measure to help ensure that people feel safe and are safe in our community right now. But wouldn't it be great if we could also bring back community police officer roles in areas of identified need? People in Glenorchy still talk to me about how much better it was when we had Kendra in a community policing role. Let's also involve police in early intervention so that our future generations respect police and trust them to be there to help. On that note, greater investment in early intervention programs is desperately needed to break the cycle of crime and disadvantage. Funding of $3.7 million over 3 years to JCP Youth to support at-risk young Tasmanians is welcomed, but if we are to ever break the poverty cycle, we must invest more in programs and supports and earlier in the life cycle. This will not only provide children with the best possible life chances, but also help our economy as well in reducing reliance on welfare and expenditure on areas like health and justice. On justice, I note targeted funding in the budget to help our Magistrates Court to reduce court backlog and ensure it can manage the ongoing case complexity, and this too is welcomed. However, a review of the distribution of resources across our court and tribunal system, I think, would be very enlightening. And will the long-promised and multi-million-dollar Astria case management system ever be in action in our court system? Shout out to the overstretched staff at the Magistrates Court who do their very best to provide people with fair and equitable access to justice on a limited budget every day. Confirmation of funding for the regional jobs hubs until 2027 is also welcomed. I'm very proud, as I know the member for Prosser is, of my involvement with particularly the Glenorchy Jobs Hub, and I would love to see the Glenorchy Jobs Hub's remit extended to also service Hobart so that people between Creek Road and Kingston also have access to this valuable service. I'd also love to see the integration of youth workers and a youth space into the Glenorchy model to provide more support for the young people who are disengaged with education and or at risk of entering the youth justice system. I'm hopeful we can continue to build on the success of the Jobs Hubs. Moving on, I give warning that I'm about to talk about child sexual abuse, and I acknowledge that this may be distressing to some. I want to talk about those who I feel have not had a voice, who may be feeling forgotten or invisible through the recent Commission of Inquiry. I'm referring to those who have suffered abuse outside of institutional settings. The budget overview refers to funding to fully respond to the Commission of Inquiry recommendations and specifically mentions Tasmania's Arch Centres supporting victim survivors of institutional abuse. Of course, this is welcomed and necessary, but what about support for those who have suffered abuse outside of institutional settings? Let's be mindful of the potential harm that the necessary but distressing and painful Commission of Inquiry and the associated media attention has caused to those who have been abused in the homes of family and friends and or in settings that are not government institutions. Whilst this may not be the fault of the government, and certainly was not the subject of the inquiry, we do need to be mindful of the impact of these discussions on those who have suffered abuse. We need to acknowledge it could impact them, be mindful of how and where we discuss it accordingly, and offer appropriate support to anyone who may feel affected by the actions that the government is taking in response right now. I am hopeful that acknowledgement and some supports for victim survivors will extend to all those who have been abused. For help to heal trauma is essential if we are to address some of our wicked problems in family violence, housing, health and education. Speaking of trauma, I note the budget includes $900,000 over 2 years for key development coaches at each of the safe space sites, helping Tasmanians overcome trauma and other barriers that can get in the way of finding and keeping a home. I'm pleased to hear this acknowledgement of the impact of trauma in the rationale for this funding. Let's hope we insert this same acknowledgement and support for healing into services earlier on, so that we are addressing the impacts before people are at the stage of needing safe space services. In relation to health, I welcome $15 million for a new diagnostic breast care centre. But as I have long called for a permanent breast care centre to be established in Glenorchy, I was somewhat disappointed to hear it will be based in Hobart. The pink bus that is stationed in Glenorchy between October and December each year is always oversubscribed, because Glenorchy is far more accessible than Hobart, not just for women in Glenorchy but from outlying areas too. Transport, parking, even unfamiliarity with the Hobart CBD are all factors that potentially prevent some women from regular breast screening. Only 6 out of every 10 Tasmanian women aged 50 to 74 access this service, which does save lives. I note funding for the St John's Park Mental Health Precinct too, with 15 adult mental health beds, 12 child and adolescent mental health beds and 40 older persons beds. Perhaps this will present an opportunity to more closely align our acute mental health and alcohol and drug services, given St John's Park is also home to the Department of Health's Alcohol and Drug Services Inpatient Withdrawal Unit. Importantly, I hope that people who are living with mental illness and their families and friends who support them have been and will continue to be involved in the co-design of the infrastructure and services that these new facilities will provide. Whilst these acute mental health facilities are needed, there's no mention of increased investment in prevention and early intervention, which is critical if we are to prevent people becoming acutely unwell, and the need for these beds and staff in the first place. The member for Rumney referred to the government's aim to be the healthiest state by 2025. We've had a Healthy Tasmania strategy since 2016, but we've not invested anywhere near enough to make a real difference, nor have we been bold enough to address poverty and disadvantage as the root cause of poor health outcomes. If we are to reduce the cost of acute health care, we must reduce the reliance on our health system at the pointy end. Addressing poverty and disadvantage is critical to this. So it's pleasing to see a new Early Years Workforce Development Fund will include funding for 20 scholarships for psychology and speech-language pathology students, roles we know can really make a difference when it comes to early intervention to help a child have the best life chances possible. I also acknowledge initiatives like Ticket to Play and Ticket to Wellbeing are included in the budget, providing annual vouchers to help with the cost of participation in sport and physical activity. And whilst welcome, this ultimately only addresses the middle class barrier of cost. Barriers like transport, access, parental engagement still prevent kids from disadvantaged backgrounds from participating. I really hope that at some point, wholeheartedly addressing poverty and disadvantage becomes a focus at budget time. On this note, it is pleasing to see funding to upgrade playgrounds and sports courts in schools in the budget, because participating in sport at school overcomes all of these barriers. I really hope priority will be given to projects that increase or provide use and access by community sporting organisations in allocating this funding, because I imagine there won't be enough to meet the need across all schools. I'm hopeful for greater linkages between schools and sporting clubs through these grants. On grants, the member for McIntyre referred to the 15 pages of election commitments tallying $1 billion.
1.3 billion.
$1.3 billion, thank you. The member for Launceston referred to funding for bowls clubs, and I also noticed election commitments to 25 bowls clubs in the budget. I wondered, what is this funding for, and what was the process for choosing the recipients? Because during my time working at Sport and Recreation Tasmania in the grants area, competition for grant funding was fierce, and we took very seriously our assessment of grant applications to ensure the best use of taxpayer funds. Shout out to the public servants who are no doubt frustrated by the election cash splash, which makes a mockery of the hard work that they do and are required to do in ensuring taxpayer funds are distributed with due process and on merit. Speaking of sporting facilities, I note the reference on page 350 of Budget Paper Number 2, Volume 1, to $49.7 million over 4 years for new southern Tasmanian sporting facilities. So I'm keen to get clarity on what this includes next week in estimates. I found it interesting that whilst many other similar projects have their own line item, commitment to the northern suburbs appear to be bundled into this broader line item. Well, at least I hope they are, for the commentary was scant on detail. I'm desperately hoping this $49.7 million includes funding for the Northern Suburbs multi-purpose indoor court facility, which was promised back in 2018. Because whilst the Northern Suburbs Community Recreation Hub in Launceston appears to be well on the way, the kids of Glenorchy continue to miss out because the courts promised to them in 2018 still have not been delivered. I'm optimistic the $5 million promised for the Glenorchy pool is included here too. This is listed as an election commitment on page 313 of Budget Paper Number 2, Volume 1, but on my read I can't see it as a specific line item anywhere. This project is really important not only to the people of Glenorchy, but also Greater Hobart, as it is an asset that is used by people from all over Greater Hobart. I can't see a specific reference to the Jack Jumpers High Performance Training Centre either, although there is a specific line for the AFL High Performance Training Centre, so I look forward to some clarification on this in estimates. The government has indicated it will provide up to $30 million for the Northern Suburbs Community Courts in Glenorchy, funding of $15 million for the Jack Jumpers High Performance Training Centre and $5 million for the Glenorchy pool upgrades, which adds up to $50 million, a little more than the $49.7 million included in this line item. So again, I look forward to getting clarity on where all of these projects, which are really important to my community, appear in the budget next week. Whilst these projects are important to meet immediate needs, what is ultimately needed is the development of a regional sport and recreation infrastructure plan. The Greater Hobart Councils have been requesting state government funds to assist with the preparation of one for Greater Hobart for some time, only to be told that the government is doing a statewide sport and recreation infrastructure audit and strategy. Years on though, we are yet to see any evidence of this. Wouldn't it be wise to have a high performance and community sport and recreation infrastructure planned and delivered according to a well thought out strategy based on participation forecasts demonstrating need and geotechnical data to ascertain the suitability of locations? Much of the community and political angst about high performance training centres and community facilities could have been avoided if only the time was taken to strategically plan for these assets, with local and state governments working together. I don't profess to have the answers to how we can work our way out of the perilous financial position Tasmania is in, but it's pretty clear that we can't keep doing what is being done. Spending more than we earn, racking up the bill for future generations. To ensure government services continue operating and public servants continue to get paid, it is incumbent upon members to support the budget, despite the fact that non-government members have no input into the development of it, as far as I'm aware, and receive it just 4 or 5 days before being asked to comment on it. There appears to be little opportunity to use the collective intelligence and goodwill of all members in this and the other place to work together to achieve change. Little opportunity to have a say on how we can do things differently to improve our budget before it's landed on us. So how do we work together to achieve change? I appreciate the solution-focused suggestions from the member for Nelson about the need for review and reform of our taxation system, and I've read opinion pieces from the member for Murchison on the same. Maybe that can be achieved in this 51st Parliament.
I think the Honourable Member for Murchison wrote about 13 opinion pieces.
Yeah, I've read a few. Don't give up. Don't give up. We've already seen the Parliament operating differently than in the past, with non-government agendas receiving the support of both houses. Yep. So I look forward to more conversations with colleagues about this. I would add that any such review of our taxation and revenue system should also include local government. For the drawn-out and costly review of local government completed in October last year did not incorporate a thorough review of the funding model for local government or make recommendations for alternative models. The review made a number of recommendations pointing to the need for review of local government tax revenue, rating systems and fees and charges frameworks. It also made recommendations that roles and responsibilities of state and local government to deliver community services and infrastructure need to be more clearly defined. It is critical these recommendations are implemented if local government reform achieves the aim of increasing sustainability of local government and provides more equity in services across communities. It appears the government does not appreciate picking up the responsibilities of the Commonwealth Government. Well, memo to the government, local government doesn't appreciate picking up the responsibilities of the state government either. But above all, the community doesn't appreciate any level of government passing the buck, so it's incumbent on those in power to work together to sort it out.
Orders of the day. Resumption of debate on the question that the budget papers and appropriation bills number 1 and 2, 2024 be noted. Ms Thomas.
The honourable member for Elwick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I only have a tiny bit left of my contribution that I was on my feet delivering as the lunch bell went. And I was saying, it appears the government does not appreciate picking up the responsibilities of the Commonwealth Government. Memo to the government, local government doesn't appreciate picking up the responsibilities of the state government either. But above all, the community doesn't appreciate any level of government passing the buck. So it is incumbent on those in power to work together to sort it out, to replace shifting blame with sharing responsibility to deliver for the people we represent. I note that the Public Accounts Committee has established an inquiry into the establishment of a parliamentary budget office, so I look forward to exploring this as a member of the committee. I am really hopeful the findings will help us to establish processes that enable us to better use our collective intelligence and goodwill across the Parliament to see our great state of Tasmania and goodwill across, to see our great state of Tasmania in a financial position that will enable future generations to thrive and prosper. Let's govern not just for now, but for future generations. I note the 2024-25 budget.
Yeah, we got there.